Pointless.
No, I think, well, you'll have to ask your wife about whether she's found it helpful as well. That would be a fascinating thing, actually, to know whether it seems different from her perspective without her having known that you're engaging to the world, but to the self too. I think that's a very useful message to constantly what I do often, I don't know if this is generally very useful message to constantly what I do often, I don't know if this is generally helpful for people, but to try and alternate that a bit. So when I just walk around the world, it's a bit like a kind of walking meditation in some ways. I will just occasionally stop and just reflect on this for a bit. Just think about the colors that I'm seeing and just think about, where are these colors? Are they out there? They seem to be out there, but where are they? They're in the interaction between the world and my brain. And recognizing that, I think, really can be very helpful. It really does introduce this space between how things seem and how they are in a way that allows us to better communicate with others, because we can recognize that they have their own kind of creative act of perception too.
Yeah. One thing I've started doing over the past few months, I don't even think I've told my wife that I'm doing this, but I sometimes, when I'm going to see her after let's say a day's work, or when I'm interacting with her, have this internal mantra, start from zero, which is this idea that, and I think this speaks to your work, and I'm sure you'll give me your perspective shortly, but this idea that often when we're interacting with people, we're so conditioned by our previous interactions that it can colour positively or negatively the present experience. And I think many people in, social interactions will realise that a lot of the time they're not reacting to what is actually happening. It's what they think is happening based on what has previously happened.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, it's a bit like that speech example.
Yeah.
That what we're reacting to is what we think is being said.
Exactly. So this whole start from zero idea that I'm playing around with is this idea, can I show up and interact with my wife as if this is the very first time I've met her? Which of course is impossible to a certain degree because, I've been married for over 15 years now, right? So it's not the first time. But there's something really liberating and enjoyable about trying to interact in that way. I'm really enjoying it. I feel it gives a different kind of experience. Although I haven't told her that's what I'm doing sometimes, I think when she hears this, because she's the producer of the show, I'm interested in her perspective. I'll, maybe tell you next time we talk, but I do actually do that sometimes. And I think it's a really nice and beautiful way to try and interact with people. But would you say it's going against what our brain is there to do? Our brain is a predictive organ. So how does an exercise like that, do you feel, help us? Or is it pointless?
No, I think, you have to ask your wife about whether she's found it helpful as well. That would be a fascinating thing, actually, to know whether it seems different from her perspective without her having known that you're engaging in this exercise. It sounds potentially extremely valuable because it does strip away some of the preconceptions we bring to our interactions. And yes, the brain has evolved as a prediction machine, but that doesn't mean it's always going to do the right thing in every specific situation. The brain has evolved in general to do the right sort of things at the right sort of times. But of course, this can mean very different things. And
of course, it's evolved for safety, not harmony, right? So it's there to predict things to keep us safe. But in a lot of relationships, of course, not all relationships, but in many relationships, the issue isn't safety, it's harmony, right? So maybe what the brain has been evolutionarily wired to do is working against harmonious relationships some of the time. I think we could make that case.
I think you could. I think one of the things that really screams out to us when we think about the vast tract of time over which our bodies and brains have evolved is that the environments in which they were evolving are very, very different from the world we live in now.
Yeah.
Very different. Think about things like how we deal with climate change. We can't, even though we know it's a problem, it's very hard to experience it as being the problem until we start to see storms happening and immediate catastrophes happening in places. We didn't evolve in a world where it was necessary to perceive things changing over that kind of timescale, even though geologically it's incredibly fast. Psychologically, it's so slow as to not be salient at all. And that applies as much to social circumstances as well. Probably the social circumstances that our ancestors existed in were very different. People make all kinds of claims based on this. There's a whole discipline of evolutionary psychology, which is just, it's interesting, but sometimes it's a little bit weak, I think, because it's a lot of speculation. But I think the truth is fundamental that indeed, our brains did not evolve to deal with the world in which we live. So then it can be very important in the world in which we live to notice the habits that our brain gets us into and to challenge them when we can.
A couple of times in this conversation, the phrase "the self" has come up. And I know in being you have spent, a lot of time trying to unpick what is the self. as you see it now in 2023, if someone says to you, Anna, what is the self? What do you say?
I would say the self is not the thing that does the experiencing, like the mini me behind my eyes sitting somewhere in my brain. The self is a kind of perception too. The self is a set of perceptual predictions. The self is a creative act.
So who we are is a series of perceptions and predictions.
Right.
So that means then the self is changeable.
It's always changing. It's relatively tempting to think that the self is this essence that is the recipient of this perceptual information that comes from the world and that decides what to do next and then does it in this sort of cycle of we sense things, we think things, and we act in the world. But what I think is much closer to the truth is that experiences of the world and of the self are both based on exactly the same principles of the brain making predictions about what's going on and updating these predictions, testing them against the world. The relevant part of the world when it comes to the self is largely the body. So the body, if you think about things, one thing I find helpful is to think about things from the perspective of your brain.
Okay.
And just try and imagine that you are a brain. You know, you're locked inside this bony vault of the skull. And the purpose of the brain is to try to, at a first approximation, figure out what's going on.
Okay.
When it comes to the world, we've already told the story. The brain doesn't have direct access to what's actually there. It has to make predictions and update these predictions based on the sensory information it gets. And that's what we perceive. You know, we actively generate the world that we experience. We don't just passively perceive it. But then the body too. You know, the brain is somewhat cut off from the body. It doesn't have direct access to what shape the body is, where it is in space, or even what it's doing on the inside. It gets a lot of sensory information. You can see the body, we can touch things. When it comes to the interior of the body, things like heart rate and blood pressure, there's a lot of nerves that carry information about the internal state of the body to the brain. And the brain has to undergo the same process. It can't just read out the state of the body. It has to infer it. It has expectations about what's going on, and it perceives the state of the body as, again, a kind of internally creative act. Now,
But you can train it, can't you? Like, you can train it in the sense that you're right about interoception, that perception of our internal state, I guess. Is that an accurate definition?
yeah, it's the perception of the body from within. And we tend to think of perception as this, like the five senses, right? Hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, seeing. But there are many other senses. You know, we sense our body position, we sense our body movement, we have a sense of balance, and then we have all these senses that tell the brain about what's going on inside the body, and that's all interoception.
And I think interoception is something that can be trained. You know, you hear stories of yogis who spent years, you know, putting their attention on their internal state, being able to actually feel their gut contracting, right? To many of us, we'll say, that's ridiculous, you can't do that. But the more you understand, or certainly the more I learn about the brain and how adaptable our bodies and brains are to what we're doing, you think, well, yeah, it's very believable to me that would be the case if you spend a lot of time training yourself for that. And I kind of feel that many of us are, I would think that many of us are more disconnected than we have ever been from our internal state because of the way many of us live now, with all this tech, all this distraction, all this external stuff. You know, if you get up first thing in the morning and go straight onto your phone and are constantly consuming all the time other stuff, you're not putting attention inwards. And I think it's a big problem for health, for happiness, for our well-being. You know, I've said for many years that the most important practice I do on a daily basis for my own health and happiness is a practice of solitude. There's many things I do within that solitude, but of course we've already touched on meditation and mindfulness, and I do have concerns with trackers potentially in this kind of like now getting to the point where some people need a sleep tracker to tell them how they feel. Of course, not everyone uses them like that, but I think this internal perception of ourselves, I think, is really, really important. Any comments on that?
Definitely. I think I agree with everything you said there. And there is a lack of attention in our modern culture to this. And there's this sort of dominant cultural narrative that the brain is maybe primarily a thinking thing, and the body is just something that needs to be kept healthy in order to stay alive longer. And this idea also that the brain is a kind of computer, and maybe the mind is the software running on the wetware of the brain.
What do you think about that?
I think it's wrong. I think computers are extraordinary and powerful, but we've always used a dominant technology as a metaphor for how the brain works. Before computers, it was something like telephone exchanges, and before that, it was something like networks of pipes. So we've always reached to technology. Now it's changing, and maybe we think of the brain as a little bit more like the internet, a big cloud of information processing. But all of these things are inadequate. The brain is its own thing. It has its own reality. And if we think of it as a kind of computer, then the body fades a little bit into the background. Because for a computer, it doesn't much matter so long as it's light enough to carry it around and its screen is big enough and so on. It doesn't have an interiority in the same way that bodies do. So when we learn to pay attention to our bodies, I totally agree, by the way. I don't think you need to be a yogi for thousands of years. I think we can all learn to pay attention to what's going on in our bodies a little bit more. Meditation is, again, a way of doing this. And one of the conduits to meditative practice is to really pay attention to the breath and to notice what's happening in your body as you breathe. And then when you move on from there, one of the ways I think it can be very useful for mental health is the relationship between the body and the emotions that we feel. Now, it's easy to feel an emotion and look for its cause out there in the world or in somebody else. But if we pay attention to what's happening when we feel an emotion, we pay attention to what's happening inside our bodies, it becomes clear that a large part of any emotional response is our brain's interpretation of what's happening in the body. When I feel anxiety, I try to, with more or less success depending, really notice what's happening in the body, and you can feel it. It's like, wow, my arms, my hands and my feet feel different. Anxiety for me tends to appear in the extremities of my body. And when you realize that, and then it can help dissolve the negativity of these emotions, because you realize that they're just constructions. They're not an objectively valid reaction to what's going on in the world. That's something that's happening in my body. And if you allow that to change, the body can change.
Yeah.
And then the emotion changes too.
Yeah, I love that. Just two things there. Firstly, relating to what you said a few minutes ago, that we can all start paying a bit more attention to ourselves, what's going on inside. And of course, as we say, meditation is one way we can do that. I've been a fan of barefoot shoes, minimalist shoes, for many years for a variety of different reasons. And I think there are all kinds of benefits for our gait and our movements of wearing them. But one of the benefits I also think relates to this, which is often we can go for walks these days and be very disconnected. People will be listening to this right now on a walk with earbuds in, and I have no problem with that. I think that can be a very enjoyable way to have a walk. But you can also go for a walk in a very mindful way. And I think some people can be mindful whilst listening to podcasts and walking, for sure. But one of the benefits I found when people, myself included, wear minimalist shoes and these barefoot shoes when walking is that you naturally become more mindful, because you start to really feel what your foot is doing as you're walking, as you're interacting with the ground. And it's a really quite beautiful experience. I think that's one of the untold benefits of wearing shoes like this, for example. So that was just one sort of reflection I wanted to comment on. The other thing, what you're saying about paying attention to your body, that one of my favorite bits in Being You was, I think, this section where you were talking about going through the history of how we think about emotions. do we feel sad and then cry, or do we cry and then feel sad? And I think intuitively many of us will go, no, I feel sad. That's why I'm crying. But you sort of unpick why that may not be the case, which I found really interesting. I wonder if you could expand on that in a second. But there was also this study you referenced in the 1970s, which was just brilliant. My recollection of that study was about these men who were on, going over this narrow bridge where there was going to be a big fall on either side. And there was something about a female questionnaire. Maybe you could explain the study, because it was truly profound.
It's a wonderful study. Unfortunately, it's the kind of study that would be impossible to get the ethics to do these days for reasons which will become clear. So what happened was, it's basically testing the idea, just as you said, that what happens when we have an emotion? Is it that we feel fear and that drives changes in our body? Maybe then adrenaline starts flowing so that we can run away or fight or whatever we need to do. Or is it the other way around, where our body starts changing in a particular way and it's the perception of the change in the body that is the emotion? That's the counterintuitive view. That's the view that traces back to William James. We mentioned him before, one of the earliest psychologists already proposed this. And to test this idea, or one of the ways to test it, quite creatively, in the early 1970s, these psychologists called Dutton and Aaron took two groups of people. Each group was, I think they were male undergraduate students or young men of some sort, and half of them walked across a very precarious, what seemed to be a very precarious bridge. This was above this gorge with a raging torrent and rocks far below, and they'd walk across this bridge. And at the end of the bridge, there was an attractive woman who gave them a questionnaire. And the questionnaire was quite a vanilla questionnaire. I can't remember what it was. It was kind of a deviation, really. It wasn't that important. What was important was, she said, at the end of giving them the questionnaire, said, if you have any questions about the study or the questionnaire, here's my number, give me a call. The other group of male young men went across a fairly boring bridge, much lower down, very sturdy, strong handrails, not a big drop, placid waters beneath. Same thing, women at the end, questionnaire, any questions, give me a call. And what the experimenters were interested in was whether more people would call from one group than the other. And of course, what happened was, well, what do you think would happen? I mean, you know the study.
Well, I've read it.
Yeah.
So, it was, I don't know what it teaches us. Does it teach us more about men? Does it teach us more about emotions?
It's a bit hard to interpret, but what happens is, of course, more of the men who cross the rickety bridge call the woman, and they call in the hope of getting a date with that woman. And the interpretation of this was that in the group walking across the rickety bridge, they're getting physiologically quite aroused because it's scary. There's a big drop. So the adrenaline starts flowing, the cortisol starts flowing, and they're in a state of physiological excitement. When they get to the end and they have this social interaction with a woman, they can misinterpret their sense of physiological arousal, which was objectively caused by the walking across the bridge, as a sense of romantic or sexual excitement between the man and the woman.
So the body has been stimulated. There's a degree of arousal in the body from being on top of this bridge. But the meaning, going back to what we've been talking about all throughout this conversation, the perception, the meaning that we give to that arousal depends on the scenario. So if there was no woman there, let's say, they just finished and went on, they presumably would be interpreting that as fear. That's why I'm feeling like this. That's why I'm feeling exhausted or a bit fraught or whatever. But because there was a woman there who gave them their phone number, and I got to say that as we're talking about this, I appreciate how politically incorrect this kind of conversation is in 2023.
Exactly.
This was a study done in the 1970s.
This was in the early 1970s.
Right, okay, so we're putting it out there on the table, so there's no misinterpretation. But that same physiological arousal in the body was interpreted differently. which is really quite remarkable, isn't it? So that then speaks to this idea that what our body picks up the signals first and then our brain gets involved to put a meaning to it.
I think rather than it being a like one thing happens then the other, I think for most of us, most of the time, these things are happening at once. Like the emotion that you feel will indeed control your body too. You know, it's this kind of circular causality here. But I think the important lesson I certainly draw from this is it underlines the same principle is applying when we experience the world and our brain comes up with an interpretation of what we see, what we hear. You know, did that person say this thing? Or you know, what color is that car? It's the same process that's happening when we feel an emotion. That yes, there's some sensory information. In this case, it's saying like the heart is beating fast and cortisol levels are high. But the emotion that we feel that corresponds to that is not given purely by that change in the body. It's the brain's interpretation of the meaning of that change.
Yeah.
That's what the emotion is.
So interesting, Anil. It really is. Just to close off this part of the conversation on the self, let's say, one thing I really want to ask you is if the self is changeable, if it really is a series of perceptions, in your view, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with the research on psychedelics and potential therapeutic applications of things like depression, but if we're saying that sometimes in depression people get stuck in a way of thinking, in a way of being, they have maybe a rather fixed perception of self. One thing we know that many people report on the other side of psychedelic experiences is that you almost bust through the idea of a fixed self. That sense of self often gets stripped away, where people will talk about there being, oh, there are multiple experiences here. There's a sense of connection with other people, the natural world, all kinds of things, right? So, and again, as a medical doctor, I have to highlight, you know, psychedelics in many countries in the UK are currently illegal. Yes, research is being done on them in very prestigious institutions like Imperial College London, I think King's College London, Johns Hopkins in America. But in your view, is that one of the reasons why they may well have such profound implications for some people suffering with mental health problems?
I think it might be. There's this phrase in the psychedelic literature of shaking the snow globe. You know, our normal modes of encountering the world and the self are thrown up in the air. They're thrown up for grabs a little bit in the psychedelic state, which gives the opportunity for them to resettle in different ways. And it happens directly in experience. I think one of the reasons psychedelics for some people might work is precisely that they reveal in the first person, directly in experience, how indirect and constructed our perceptions can be. Things that we would take for granted become harder to take for granted. One common experience in psychedelics is that of ego dissolution, which is a way of saying that our experience of the self as being this inner essence, totally distinct from the world around us, that fades away, and we feel a greater sense of continuity with the world, with nature, with each other, with the universe. And that's a positive emotion to feel in some ways anyway, but I think the deeper meaning of that is it can suggest to the person that their normal way of experiencing the self doesn't always have to be like that. It is a construction. I think the other really important thing to say, though, is that psychedelics by themselves are not a magic bullet. They're not a panacea. They open up this gap. But then the context is so important. In psychedelics, people talk about set and setting. Yeah. And it's psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy that I think shows the real promise, where the psychedelics open up a space to work with that you can then utilize to explore what ways were you perceiving yourself, your body, your world, that might resettle in different, more helpful ways.
Yeah, it's, we started off talking about death, and we were talking about the different beliefs around death, but also the importance of ritual to allow those beliefs to maybe come to fruition and actually have their impacts. And I hear a similar thing here, whereby it's the psychedelic in a control setting with ritual attached to it to allow it to do its work. Is that a fair comparison? So I know it's not quite the same thing, but I certainly heard something quite similar, how ritual is really important.
Right, actually, that's a really good point. So ritual, back to the beginning of our conversation, that provides some of the context in which we experience something like death happening to somebody else. The ritual, it provides this larger set of, it gives the brain, if you like, some existing predictions, interpretations to draw on when making sense of what's happening in the body or in the world. And I do think it's important. One of the other projects that I've been doing since I finished writing Being You is this project called Dream Machine. It was actually this artist Brian Geisen who started this in the 1950s. And it's the use of fast flickering light on closed eyes, which can also give people quite interesting and quite unexpected visual hallucinations and experiences. And a lot of people feel better after this kind of experience. But we put it in a setting where there was a lot of context, where there was a lot of structure around it, so that the experience wouldn't be destabilizing for people. And people were held throughout the journey in a way that encouraged them to reflect on what having this unusual experience meant for the way they would perceptually encounter the world and the self in the rest of their daily lives. But it's potentially an interesting intervention because it gives you a powerful experience, but it doesn't rely on psychedelics. It's something that's much more in principle accessible to people.
Super fascinating. Circling back to consciousness, if an 8-year-old child was sitting here right now and said, Anil, what is consciousness and why does it matter to me? What would you say to them?
To the 8-year-old child, I would say consciousness is what goes away when you go to sleep and you're not dreaming, and it's what comes back when you wake up. Consciousness is what gives... I'm going to start this again. It's incredibly hard to define what consciousness is, even after studying it for so long. Especially when you try and explain what it is to an 8, because we take it for granted. This is the thing. It's so hard to define something that is kind of always there for us. Perhaps the easiest way to define consciousness, it's the redness of red. It's the painfulness of pain. It's the sweetness of honey. It's the fact that for everything we do and everything we are, there is something it is like. It feels like something to taste honey. Feels like something to be happy or to be sad. Feels like something simply to touch a piece of wood. It's what makes us more than biological objects roaming around in the subjective dark.
It's magical to hear you explain it like that. Part of what you said reminded me of a conversation I had with Dacher Keltner a few months ago. He's a scientist in Berkeley who wrote a book on awe. What's interesting is in that book, there's a bit of a struggle with a definition, maybe a bit like consciousness. And I actually find that very comforting, that there are some things in life, like consciousness, like awe, that we can't necessarily accurately define, that we can't put an envelope around, that we can't use our kind of human language that, by definition, in many ways, is limiting. I actually really like that. I think it leaves room for the mysterious and the mystical, and the fact that as humans, we don't know everything yet. Do you know what I mean? I quite like that personally. It may be difficult for you as a scientist who's trying to study it, so you define it, so you can actually measure things. But to me, I actually really like that.
No, I think it's important that there is this space, and it's a bit of a misconception about how science progresses, that we need these kind of watertight definitions that exhaustively capture every aspect of a phenomenon. And I think about how we've come to define and think about life. I mean, life 150 years ago was as perplexing to people as consciousness might be now. People didn't understand how life could appear from matter. You know, did we need a spark of life, an élan vital, a divine spark perhaps? And now, even though we, you know, as scientists, as doctors, we don't understand everything about life, there's no longer this big sense of mystery. You know, life is part of nature, and we understand that. We can control aspects of life. We can even synthesize life in the lab now. But there's still something that's very difficult if you ask people to define what life is. You know, it's not one thing, it's many things. And I think the same is true for consciousness. It's not one thing, it's many things, but it's a collection of things that share this property that feels like something to be conscious.
No, I love that.
And we can hold that definition, and so long as we know intuitively what we're talking about, that's fine, that's enough.
One of the things that is, I think, remarkable for me when I think about your work, when I think about your book, when I think about this topic of consciousness, is how it speaks to so many different disciplines. It speaks to psychology, philosophy, maths, science, spirituality. It kind of, everything converges in this topic. It must make it very fun and challenging as well to study and write about. But I think that's, it's really exciting for me to think of it through that lens. And as I said, when I was researching for this conversation, because consciousness is not something we've covered on this podcast before, right? And I've been really trying to think deeply about it, both from your work and from observing how other people are talking about it. Eckhart Tolle, the spiritual teacher, says you don't have consciousness, you are consciousness. Okay, so from his perspective, I found that really, really interesting. I was watching a Swami talk about consciousness through the lens of, I think, the Vedanta school of thought. And again, I don't claim to be an expert here, but I really resonated with this, where they said consciousness is actually within you. This Swami was saying it's not a part of your body and mind. It illuminates and pervades your body and mind. It exists outside your body and mind. You may have a different perspective here. It is known through our minds and bodies, and without our minds and bodies, it is there, but it can't be known or experienced. And the way he was describing it was, again, I'll try and make this relevant to the audio listeners as well as people watching on video, but there's light here now in this space between us, right? But if I put my hand there, I can now really see the light. The light is reflecting. I'm aware of that studio light that's there and how it's coming off that. And I think he was explaining consciousness like that, as in, without the hand there, the light's there, but I can't feel it and experience it until my hand is there. So to me at least, and I think this is a good place to try and close off this conversation, is consciousness, in your view, generated within us, or does it exist there out in the ether and we simply experience it?
I think consciousness is the medium through which we experience everything, whether that's the self or the world. This means, in a sense, it's out there because if I look at you now, I experience a person sitting across a desk from me. So that seems to be out there in the world. There's something out there, there's a body, there's all kinds of things going on out there, but my experience is of something external to me. But the mechanisms of consciousness, the actual stuff that gives rise, that makes experience of any kind possible, that I do think is inside the brain. But the contents of consciousness, that's what's important in our lives to each of us. It's not the fact that consciousness happens to exist so per se, it's the varied things that are experienced, the world, the self, other people, emotions, light, color, beauty, awe. These are not purely within the brain. They depend on the body, they depend on the world. I mean, maybe in a trivial way, if you could get, so here's what I would believe, and again I might be wrong, that in any given instant, what you're experiencing depends on the state of your brain at that point. Put the brain in a particular state, you get a particular experience of the world, of the body, of other people. But in our lives, to get the brain to be in particular states, we need the body, we need the world, we need other people. And in that sense, the contents of our consciousness depend fundamentally on the interactions between the brain, the body, the world, society, culture, the universe.
I know, you're doing incredible work. You are leaving us with a lot of things to think about and reflect on. That's coming up to the studio.
Thanks, Rongan. It's been a delight.
If that conversation resonated with you, here is another incredibly powerful one that I really think you're going to enjoy. Give it a click.
If you actually went to the happiness gym several times a week, you will actually have a happier life, right? And the happiness gym is very straightforward. It's a set of skills that you need to practice.
For centuries, the best clues to ancient life have come from fossils. But now, a new window on the past is opening.
How can we travel back in time? Is there a time machine? Yes. It's DNA. It's ancient DNA.
These are fragile molecules that fall apart outside the body.
How long can DNA survive?
With ancient DNA, we're trying to go back in time. But time is the enemy.
A dramatic breakthrough is transporting us millions of years back into the past, to before the last ice age, revealing surprising creatures that thrived when our planet was far warmer than it is today. Could ancient genes from this lost world help us adapt to a changing planet?
We're stealing genetic secrets of the past so we can rescue the future.
Go behind the scenes on the hunt for the oldest DNA. Right now on Nova.
Sailing a river through the heart of cities and landscapes with Viking brings you close to iconic landmarks, local life, and cultural treasures. On a river voyage, you can unpack once and travel between historic cities and charming villages, experiencing Europe on a Viking longship. Viking, exploring the world in comfort. Learn more at viking.com.
Buried beneath Greenland's ice sheet are the remains of a living world that ended when the Ice Age began, over 2 million years ago. One scientist is on a quest to reveal that lost world with ancient DNA.
When I look at this place, I see one huge cold storage room for ancient DNA. I spent my life trying to find older and older DNA, and this is the limit of the possible. And maybe it's impossible. What we are trying to recover is DNA millions of years older than any DNA ever recovered. So we're trying to reach back before the last ice age.
Once, fossils were our only hope of shedding light on life in the distant past. But ever since scientists first recovered DNA from an extinct animal 40 years ago, fossil hunters have been sharing the stage with gene hunters. We've peered into a fascinating world of extinct species, Ice Age beasts, even our Neanderthal cousins.
When I look back in time, the sharpest tool I have is DNA, the genes of long-dead plants and animals. This is a far more detailed record of the past than the fossils alone can ever give us.
But the older DNA gets, the fainter the signal. The moment a living thing dies, its DNA starts falling apart.
Of course, we are never going to stop wondering, exactly how far back can we go? What is the limit of DNA preservation?
You know what people mean when they say mission impossible, right? They actually mean it might be possible. No one has ever succeeded in getting DNA older than 1 million years. But our tools are getting better.
And as the technology gets more powerful, these scientists are chasing a new discovery.
To everyone's surprise, the secret to smashing the limit could be lying right beneath our feet. Now, we're on the verge of recovering genetic traces of a lost world from before the Ice Age. This ancient DNA, forged in a hotter climate, might even help us survive our own warming world.
When I was in school, if you had said to my teachers, someday Eske will be a scientist, they would have laughed. I mean, I would have laughed too. I was a rebel, a troublemaker. I wasn't good at the typical things that people connect to being a scientist. I was a school failure. That's the truth. But I think I have one capability which has proven super valuable. I have a very good imagination. I used to think I was born too late. When I realized there's no frontiers left, everything is mapped. But there is a frontier. Our frontier is the deep past. That is where we can still be explorers.
In Iceland, Eske Willerslev's team is pulling mud from the bottom of frozen lakes.
Mud laced with DNA from a long-gone world.
DNA is a blueprint, right? It's the code that makes you who you are. Different individuals have different DNA codes. Different species have different DNA codes. So it means if you can pull out a piece of the DNA code, you can actually map it to all known DNA codes, all known blueprints. And then you can identify, well, what organism are we talking about here?
On this expedition, Eske's team is hunting for DNA from before the Vikings settled Iceland, about 1,200 years ago.
1,200 years is nothing in ancient DNA research, especially in the Arctic where it's cold. Still, at a certain point, DNA becomes too difficult to read. So there is a limit. And I would say I've always been obsessed with this limit, to push this limit. How far can we go? I still haven't got an answer to that question. But I'm sure it's further than what we think.
So
What is the limit? Back in the 90s, some scientists got a little carried away.
Jurassic Park was not a documentary. The early days of ancient DNA were a bit of a disaster, unless you're in PR, in which case it was fantastic. There was a whole bunch of what we now know is complete nonsense that was published with just abandon, just excitement and enthusiasm, rather than actual science. I mean, everybody wants there to be dinosaur DNA. And so somebody who says, hey, I got this really well-preserved dinosaur, and guess what? There's DNA in it. Of course the media are going to be super excited about this.
And Hollywood couldn't resist.
So let's reconstruct Jurassic Park. Scientists go somewhere hot because amber forms in hot places, and they find a really beautiful piece of amber, inside of which they can see this fantastic insect that looks perfectly preserved. They take a big needle and they stick it into the insect and they draw out blood, presumably from a dinosaur, and then they take that blood to the lab and they do some magic that for some reason involves frogs, even though we already knew at the time that birds were the closest living ancestor of dinosaurs, and then more magic happens and dinosaurs are back to life.
But we now know a lot more about DNA than we used to. And everything we know tells us, no question about it, that this molecule just doesn't stick around for millions and millions of years.
Dinosaurs have been extinct for more than 65 million years. We will never get dinosaur DNA. Jurassic Park is not going to happen. I'm sorry. Getting DNA out of things that are alive is easy. This is because modern DNA from living organisms, is in fantastic condition. Long strands of DNA, if you can think of it kind of as party streamers. Ancient DNA is more like confetti. The reason that modern DNA party streamers get chopped up into the confetti that is ancient DNA is because of random processes that happen outside the body. Mostly things like UV radiation from the sun. When we walk outside, UV hits our skin and it gets into our cells and it damages our DNA. But when we're alive, we have proofreading enzymes that will come along and fix those damages. Otherwise, we would get cancer every time we walked outside. But proofreading and fixing DNA, this is an energy-requiring process. And after you're dead, there is no more energy.
With ancient DNA, it's always been a needle in the haystack problem. This is a fragile molecule, so even when we first understood that DNA could stick around after death, the question was, how much and where? Early on, we thought only in soft tissue, so a human mummy or a frozen mammoth. In about 1990, we had the huge insight that fossil bones and teeth could protect DNA like time capsules. But well-preserved fossils are rare, and fossils that contain DNA, they're even rarer. So in our field, that's been one of the biggest challenges. We're all chasing these precious time capsules.
3 decades ago, Eske was determined to join the hunt, but the odds were against him.
In 1995, I was a biology student and I wanted to do my research on ancient DNA, but I had no fossils. I wasn't famous, so nobody wanted to give me fossils. That was a bit of a problem. You want to do ancient DNA, but you have no fossils. I remember I was in my flat. It was an awful day. The rain was just coming down and leaves were falling from the trees. And I saw this woman out walking her dog, and she stops. The dog squats, takes a poop. It's funny. Inspiration sometimes comes out of the strangest times. I'm looking at this miserable, wet dog, thinking, well, there's DNA in the dog. So there's DNA in the dog poop, right? But will it survive? We know there's DNA in the leaves, but we also do know that these things will disappear. After next rainfall, the dog poop will disappear. After a few years, the leaves will be gone. The question I asked myself was, what will happen to the DNA? Will that be gone too? Or will that be preserved in the soil? Because if it's preserved in the soil, we don't need any fossils. Problem solved. So I remember I went into the coffee room in Department of Zoology, where all the professors were sitting, having their lunch. And I came with this idea saying, well, what about looking in the soil for DNA of animals and plants? And they were laughing. And my supervisor turned around, was head of department, saying,
Eske, jeg har aldrig hørt så latterlig en idé i hele mit liv.
I never heard anything as stupid in my life.
No one had ever thought to recover DNA from dirt. Why would it be there? The idea is that DNA is kind of known to be such an unstable molecule in general. If you're working in a molecular biology lab and you don't look after your DNA, it's gone very fast. So yeah, it was a completely crazy idea that it would even be found. I mean, that DNA enters the environment is obvious if an animal urinates or defecates, but the DNA stays in the environment, completely crazy.
So early on, we didn't know how long ancient DNA could survive. But there was a second really big hole in our understanding: contamination. Ancient DNA getting mixed up with modern DNA. Well, the trouble is that DNA is everywhere. My DNA is now on this chair and on my hands and on my shirts, and DNA is coming out of my mouth as I talk. And there is microbial DNA absolutely everywhere. So when people were sequencing these bones, they were getting DNA, and they were saying, wow, there's DNA in these bones. It must be dinosaur DNA. I think there was some dinosaur DNA that was published that they were really excited about because it closely matched a bird. Well, turns out the field excavation team was having a chicken dinner one night.
In those early days, when I was still a student, we were all struggling with the problem of contamination, which was the big downfall of the dinosaur DNA guys of the 90s. And I decided, well, somehow we're going to solve that problem. I was working on this with another student, Anders Hansen. So we had this room that were basically our clean laboratory. But we had a problem with a mold contamination. And in the end, we became so desperate, we decided, okay, we would basically clean the entire room down with very strong bleach. We knew, well, it wasn't really allowed, and we didn't have money for gas masks. Anders got dizzy and threw up. And the security guard was coming, saying, what the is going on here? It's smelling like a swimming pool in the entire building. And Monday morning, we had to stand in front of the professor and the lab director, and they were furious, right? I mean, what are you guys doing? I mean, do you know this is totally illegal? But the good news was, even though we got all this heat, the fungi contamination were gone.
Finally, Eske had a mold-free lab.
He first tried getting DNA out of 2,000-year-old ice.
We got ice cores from Greenland, and we showed we could recover ancient fungi DNA trapped in the ice without contamination. And that was big. So then we knew we were ready to move to the next step, searching for DNA in the dirt. So I really believed in this idea of environmental DNA or dirt DNA. And more than that it could survive in the environment as ancient DNA. But I had to prove it.
Hey, Buck,
So I
I'm getting
set
wiggle on
out
down
to
to Silver
retrieve
Strand
ancient
Meadows.
DNA
So catch me
from
there.
the dirt.
Bye for
And
now.
at that point, no one had done that.
Eske was searching for DNA from the Ice Age, which ended 12,000 years ago. It kept our planet in a frigid grip for about 2.5 million years.
The Ice Age, it's an amazing period. It's the time of the big mammals. You have giant wolves, giant beavers, mammoth, mastodons, right? So I thought, imagine how much food and urine these big mammals have been produced over time, right? That is in the soil, in the surrounding, frozen in time in the Arctic. So my idea was to bring back that Ice Age world by retrieving DNA directly from the permafrost. And that permafrost I got from Siberia. So while everyone else was looking for DNA in fossil bone and teeth and discovering one species at a time, I was looking in the dirt for everything.
It's one thing to recover ancient DNA, but it's a far more daunting challenge to read those tiny fragments of genetic confetti. That is, to decode what kind of ancient life they come from. The shorter the fragment, the harder it is to identify.
A genome is like a twisted ladder. So if you think of a long ladder, every rung is a base pair. And a base is a single molecule, A, T, G, and C. A human genome is incredibly long. It has 3 billion base pairs. So that's 3 billion rungs on the ladder. That's a big number. But when we're working with ancient DNA, we're working with short pieces. Pieces just a few rungs long. And we have to hope that those little pieces contain enough unique information that we can match them to known DNA.
Some of Eske's Siberian permafrost was 400,000 years old. If he could identify species from ancient DNA frozen inside it, he would set a new record.
So it's Christmas Eve, and I'm sitting alone in the lab. Everybody have already gone home, right, for Christmas. And I'm basically checking the DNA sequences that we got out of the dirt. I'm comparing those to all known DNA sequences in the world. And when I see the results, the hairs on my back are just rising. It was bang woolly mammoth, it was bang bison, it was bang reindeer, it was bang hare, it was bang, 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 different types of plants. It worked better than I could even have imagined.
Eske had matched the ancient DNA in his Siberian dirt to known species whose genetic sequences were collected in a vast catalog. And sure enough, he found dozens of matches, including extinct species. Eske was the first to show that enough DNA can survive in the dirt to paint a picture of the past. Still a student, he just sparked a new field of science: ancient environmental DNA.
The reason the technique of environmental DNA works is that DNA is everywhere. It is raining DNA. The very problem we had with DNA contaminating samples, that DNA is falling off of me and coming out of my mouth and floating in the air around me, that is exactly the opportunity we have with environmental DNA.
So I realized it's not the scarcity of DNA that is limiting us. Environmental DNA is everywhere. So the limit is time. And this is really when I started thinking, well, how far back in time can we really push this?
So today, we are in the Holocene. That's about the last 12,000 years. Before that, it was the Pleistocene, a period of lots of ice ages, more than 20, lasted about 2.5 million years. And before that was the Pliocene, when it was much warmer than the Pleistocene.
Yeah, it was a really weird place. You would not recognize that world. When you go back 3 million years, you're in a way warmer climate. Earth was just hotter. And it had been that way for a very long time, since before the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. I'm a vertebrate paleontologist. I study the animals that live in the Arctic before the Ice Age, mammals of the Pliocene Arctic. The reality is, we don't know very much. The time before the Ice Age began, the Pliocene, it's kind of a lost world. We don't have full skeletons of any Pliocene mammals. We just have fragments, shards of bone, evidence of maybe 13 species. I still have so many questions. For a paleontologist like me, it's really frustrating.
So, where fossils are lacking, could DNA help us? Could genetic traces really endure for millions of years? Everything we knew about DNA had told us that was impossible.
The oldest DNA is the coldest DNA. DNA is fragile, so it falls apart over time, but cold slows that process down. No one has ever succeeded in getting DNA older than 1 million years. But our tools are getting better, so I think the limits might change.
20 years ago, recovering 400,000-year-old DNA from Siberian permafrost was an impressive leap back in time. The student was suddenly a professor, the youngest in Denmark. But Eske's quest had just begun.
So I just happened to get this invitation from a group of geologists to go up to northeastern Greenland. And this is a remarkable place. I mean, there you have something called the Cap Copenhagen Formation. And it's a super dry and a super cold place. Naturally, I thought northern Greenland would hold the answer. If really old DNA is going to be preserved anywhere, it's here. Northeastern Greenland, it's one of the most hostile places on Earth. Extremely cold. But even more important, this is an Arctic desert. It was too dry for glaciers to form. No glaciers to grind away the landscape. The sediments up there are perfectly preserved. In Cap Copenhagen, you're literally walking on dirt from before the Ice Age. It's incredible. This place that is almost barren ground today, right? In the sediments, we discovered chunks of trees, of wood, that are 3 million years old, but is still preserved there. I mean, you can basically take them up and use them as fuel in your campfire. So this told me two things. First, Cap Copenhagen must have looked very different in the past. And secondly, this must be among the best places in the world for long-term preservation of DNA. This gave me an idea. A naughty idea. What if we could just dig in the dirt and recover DNA millions of years old?
If your goal is to get the oldest sample, then you go where that oldest sample is likely to be. It reckons back to the age of exploration, right? I mean, think about my kids are in 4th grade, so they're learning about the explorers that went around the world. And this is kind of I think how Eska sees himself a bit. He's like, oh, you know what? There's an Arctic desert. I'm gonna go there and I'm gonna get DNA from that. And he will, because he's Eska, and that's how Eska works.
In 2005, I published this review paper where we basically claimed, well, ancient DNA cannot survive for more than 1 million years. That's the absolute limit. But in the back of my head, I was still wondering, is that really true? Could DNA survive longer than 1 million years in a place like the Cap Copenhagen Formation?
So on that same expedition, I thought, hey, we're here. Why not sample the sediments? You never know. We just might be able to find DNA.
I remember it was pretty miserable up there. We were working in a freezing Arctic desert, but it rained anyway. Still, we caught into the frozen ground, and I got my crazy samples. So I took the sediment samples back to my lab in Copenhagen. And to be honest, this was the beginning of a very frustrating project.
Those Greenland samples would tease and torment Eska and his team for the next 15 years. In the early days, Astrid Schmidt was a doctoral student in Eska's lab. When Eska offered her the Greenland samples, she jumped on them.
At that time, Eske was a star in the scientific community, and I was inspired by Eske's enthusiasm. We had a hypothesis that if the environment had been kept cold and the temperatures had not been moving up and down and fluctuated, then we would have had at least the possibility of finding ancient DNA. So we were being optimistic, knowing it was a long shot, but also knowing that we could get groundbreaking results from this. And there was DNA in the samples. We could see it, but it was super degraded.
It's not enough to see that your samples contain ancient DNA. You have to be able to identify that DNA and to know what forms of life it came from. To do that, the fragments need to be long enough. You need a certain number of base pairs in a fragment. You need enough rungs on your ladder.
When Astrid started, scientists needed at least 100 base pairs.
We did everything we could with the technology that existed, but we just couldn't overcome the central problem. The Greenland DNA was just too old, the fragments were too short. It was very frustrating.
The DNA after 1 million years was just total garbage. With, you can say, the technology in hand at the time, the DNA was completely unreadable. Well, Astrid was one of many people in my lab that tried the Cap Copenhagen samples and basically failed. In retrospect, I was probably not a very good supervisor, right? Because I kind of pushed for people to do these samples every time we had improvements of our methodology, in a hope, well, this time they will work. If that happened, it would be a career booster. But the risk associated with this project was huge, right? So it was failure after failure.
Cap Copenhagen project was, a bit sensitive. As a postdoc, if you decided to invest your time in this, it was the case of having only so many years to be able to produce excellent research. If you're not able to produce research because the technology doesn't allow it, not because you're a bad researcher, you still end up with nothing to show for it.
In 2013, I left research science and I didn't pursue science since then. I took a big risk and I paid a price.
But again, but the thing is, just like with the
In Eska's lab, students began calling the Greenland samples cursed. But Eska and his team kept returning to Greenland, hoping to find DNA in better condition. Meanwhile, 4 more students suffered under the curse, failing to recover DNA long enough to identify. They all changed careers. But as they left, new ones stepped into their shoes.
So you can imagine what I felt when these samples landed on my table. So I was a PhD student in Eske Wilderslev's lab. This was my last option also to succeed in a project that I was given as a PhD student. I was coming to the final tries of actually making this a success.
Back in the day, we needed almost 100 base pair fragments to survive in a sample in order to retrieve any DNA whatsoever. But the technology was changing, and I had a student, Mikkel, who came to me with an idea. I was immediately excited. I thought, yes, this could work. Mikkel suggested we use a powerful technique called shotgun sequencing. Shotgun sequencing itself was new, but no one had ever used it on dirt DNA. I don't know why, in retrospect. It seemed kind of obvious.
First, Mikkel proved that the shotgun technique could work on dirt DNA several thousand years old.
It really showed us that we could actually get ancient environmental DNA even from the very shortest reeds that were preserving in the samples. And the obvious next step would actually be to take on the most challenging project of them all, what we refer to as the curse, the Cap Copenhagen Formation.
In the early years of ancient DNA, we had to decide which part of the genome to look at.
Those are the giveaway parts of the genome that we call barcodes. They reveal the identity of an organism. We match those barcodes to our reference catalog, but those barcode fragments had to be long enough.
We know that DNA fragments over 100 base pairs just don't survive millions of years, even frozen high up in the Arctic. So, shotgun sequencing was a revolution. Now, instead of targeting a specific part of the genome with precision, like with a rifle, we're using a shotgun. A shotgun hits everything.
With the shotgun method, we just sequence all the DNA we can find. Then we look for matches with every genome sequence for every organism that we know of. It takes immense computing power, billions of operations, and only now are our computers powerful enough to work with fragments down to 30 base pairs. Imagine shredding War and Peace. All you have are short phrases, not even sentences. And you walk into the Library of Congress and you start looking for a match for each one of those phrases, book by book by book. There's another War and Peace in there somewhere, but you need to work through millions of other books before you find the match. And once you do, your job is to reconstruct as many pages of that novel as you can. So we were the first to use shotgun sequencing on dirt. And when we did, man, it was powerful. In science, moments like this actually feels like magic. I have no other way of putting it. It was just like that Christmas Eve, 25 years ago. As if by magic we were seeing the genetic signatures of these plants and animals appear. Bang, bang, bang. But it's different this time. Now, there's hundreds. Fleas, lemmings, Arctic hare, geese, caribou, a whole forest ecosystem. Large poplar, willow, spruce, ash, cedar trees. We're looking at a long list of organisms from a place that today is an Arctic desert.
Eske's team had recovered the genetic fingerprints of a lost world. 9 land and sea animals, from horseshoe crabs to big mammals. Over 100 plants, from mosses to forest trees.
and nearly 2,000 other organisms, including bacteria and plankton.
Some of them extinct, and many of them never detected in the Arctic. But this incredible breakthrough created another problem. If you're claiming to have recovered the world's oldest DNA, you'd better be very sure about the date.
We knew we were going to get hammered. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, right? We had to be very sure about the dates from Cap Copenhagen. That took 2 more years of hard work. We used a whole set of different methods. We looked for organisms in the sediments that we knew lived on Earth for a known period of the past. We used a biological clock based on how DNA mutates over time.
And Eska's team used 3 more independent methods to date the sediment from Greenland. When their work was done, they had made a remarkable discovery. The Cape Copenhagen DNA is at least 2 million years old.
It's important to understand that this is the minimum possible age. Taking all the lines of the dating evidence as a whole, the most likely age of the Cap Copenhagen DNA is actually 2.5 million years.
This puts us into the late Pliocene, which is the period just before we start having glaciations.
If Eska's DNA is that old, if it is Pliocene, then that is huge.
Eska had his hands on DNA from before the last ice age.
Finally, we are catching sight of the living world that existed in Greenland before the world grew cold. That was the moment. That was when we knew we had something to tell the world.
16 years after Eska began collecting dirt in Greenland, the breakthrough was published in Nature magazine. It was covered by over 400 newspapers around the world. It even landed on the front page of the New York Times. This was one of the biggest science stories of the year. Until this day, the record for the oldest DNA was from a single fossil, a mammoth that lived just over 1 million years ago during the Ice Age. Using dirt DNA instead of fossils, Eska's team shattered that record, opening a window on an unknown living world more than twice as old as that mammoth.
It feels almost magical to be able to infer such a complete picture of an ancient ecosystem from tiny fragments of preserved DNA.
When I first heard about the results from Cap Copenhagen, I just said to myself, what? What we're talking about is pushing the record back to at least 2 million years, and I believe much longer than that. It was a complete tour de force.
One of my feelings when I first saw this paper is stunned. I think we just never really thought it would be possible after years of trying to get DNA from these ancient ecosystems. We never thought we'd see such a rich and diverse ecosystem in Greenland. We're seeing the very last Arctic forests from a hotter world before the Ice Age. And these forests are unique. We have nothing like them today.
I always knew that there was forest in the high Arctic. I touched the wood of ancient trees up there. But when we looked at the sequences from Greenland, there was one that completely shocked me. Shocked everyone.
To hear that there was mastodon DNA from Cap Copenhagen, this just struck me as, whoa, how can that be? That is so far north.
Relatives of the modern elephant, mastodons were forest creatures that died out at the end of the Ice Age.
The closest to Cape Copenhagen their remains have been found is almost 3,000 miles to the south, in North America.
It comes completely out of the blue. And it was the first time that we found such a large animal in Greenland.
So, after all those years, we broke the curse of the Greenland samples. I guess you can say it was a breakthrough that immediately became a problem. The big question, of course, is how do such DNA survive beyond the 1 million year old limit? That was the mystery we had to solve. It turns out DNA survived such an incredible long time because of minerals in the soil. DNA is electrically charged, and many mineral particles that you find in the soil is also electrically charged. So therefore, DNA fragments will basically bind itself around such sediment particles. And this will reduce the rate of degradation, of the spontaneous reaction that are attacking the DNA and breaking it up. So yes, it will still be degraded, it will still be destroyed, but the rate by which this is happening is heavily reduced. It turned out that particularly certain minerals of clay and quartz binds the DNA very strongly. Bound to clay and quartz, DNA is basically frozen in time.
What is super cool about the Greenland breakthrough is the discovery that certain minerals can freeze DNA in time, because this means that everything we thought about the limits of DNA preservation are out the window.
Not back to the age of dinosaurs, but far beyond the old 1 million year limit.
So these cores that no one believed in turned out to contain the most amazing treasure. It just took us 15 years to find out how to get it out.
Amazing journey, right?
To be honest, I never really lost faith, because every limit we have ever set, we broke.
Until now, what we knew of the living world before the Ice Age, we learned from fossils. At the Canadian Museum of Nature, Natalia Rybczynski only has fragments of bone to study. But with the spectacular discovery of DNA from Greenland, finally, a detailed portrait of this lost world is emerging. And it's even stranger than scientists expected.
This was a really weird environment. You had a forest where half the year it was dark, and the other half the year it was sunshine all day around. This means that all the organisms we are uncovering had to survive half the year in darkness.
I think the thing that really blew our minds from the Pliocene is the camel.
How could this camel, known only by a few fragments of bone, survive so far north? The living world revealed by the Greenland DNA gives us some clues.
When you think about camels today, it's really easy to imagine that they evolved to live in the desert. And this is where the finding of the high Arctic camel is so mind-blowing, right? Because it's not in a desert. It's living a complete opposite to a desert. It's in a forest. Ever notice how huge a camel's eye is? Well, it turns out they have incredible vision, including night vision. That's pretty useful when it's dark 6 months of the year. One of the most dramatic features of the camel, it's the hump. It's actually a specialized fat deposit. And when you think about the importance of fat, energy storage, this is something that's also very important for animals that survive through harsh winters. The wide feet of camels, it's listed as one of the traits that helps them walk over sand, also would function well in soft snow.
We haven't found camel DNA from before the Ice Age. Not yet. But we have now recreated the forest world they were living in. And Natalia's fossils tells us they were there. This is a forest that stretched from Greenland to Canada on solid land without barriers.
We used to believe that ancient DNA could take you back a few thousand years. Today, we know we can see millions of years back in time.
Back to a hotter time, before the Ice Age, the Pliocene. A long-lost epoch that climate scientists believe may hold a lesson for us today.
The Pliocene's a big, red, flashing light, right? The Pliocene was the last time atmospheric CO2 levels were the same as today. You have to go back 3 million years to find a climate equivalent to what we're doing right now. That is a CO2 level of about 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. The new Pliocene has begun. It's called the Anthropocene. We've already altered Earth's climate. We're living in a climate that is about 1 degree C warmer globally than it should be. The climate of the Pliocene is where we're going. It's like our instruction manual for what's coming.
When the Pliocene ended and the Ice Age began, that was a big blow. But it didn't end life on Earth. All life around us has its evolutionary roots in a hotter world, including us.
And that hotter world could hold lessons for our own survival.
Greenland proves we can go much deeper in time than what we thought we would. We now have the technology to go even further back in time, potentially many millions of years.
We have access to the genetic codes of plants and animals that survived in different climates, hotter climates, drier climates. If we can sequence the genomes of those ancient organisms, maybe they can help us. And I think we're going to need help.
The rescue effort has already started. Scientists in Copenhagen have identified a gene from the Greenland DNA that helped poplar trees grow in the extreme light conditions of the high Arctic. And they've put that gene into a modern barley plant. One day, when our climate is much warmer, this barley might thrive at the top of the world, just as those ancient poplar trees did.
This is a food plant engineered for a hot future. We are stealing genetic secrets of the past so we can rescue the future. I want to do my part to rescue the future. We are going to sequence thousands, millions of ancient genomes from sediment samples all over the world. Because we are now using robots across the entire pipeline, we can do 200 samples a week. We are starting an industrial revolution in ancient DNA sequencing.
Arctic barley could be just the beginning. Scientists are gearing up to put ancient genes into rice, wheat, and other foods to help them thrive in a warming world.
Today we take for granted that all organisms are shedding DNA around in the environment. But once, this was a new idea. It all started with that dog pooping in the rain. And that is why we can do this, where a little bit of dirt contains an entire living world.
beneath the complexities of everyday life, the rules of our universe seem reassuringly simple.
This solid bridge supports my weight. The water flowing underneath always goes downhill. And when I throw this stone, it always flies through the air following a predictable path.
But as scientists peered deep into the tiny building blocks of matter, all such certainty vanished. They found the weird world of quantum mechanics.
Deep down inside everything we see around us, we found a universe completely unlike our own. To paraphrase one of the founders of quantum mechanics, everything we call real is made up of things that cannot be themselves regarded as real.
Around 100 years ago, some of the world's greatest scientists began a journey. Journey down the rabbit hole into the strange and the bizarre. They found that in the realm of the very small, things could be in two places at once. That their fates are dictated by chance. And that reality itself defies all common sense.
And at stake, that everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
The story of our descent into scientific madness begins with a most unlikely object. Berlin, 1890. Germany is a new country, recently unified and hungry to industrialize.
In this newly unified Germany, a number of new engineering companies were founded. They spent millions buying the European patent for Edison's new invention, the light bulb.
The light bulb was the epitome of modern technology, a great optimistic symbol of progress. Engineering companies quickly realized there were fortunes to be made building streetlights for the new German Empire. But what they didn't realize was that they would also unleash a scientific revolution.
Strangely enough, this humble object is responsible for the birth of the most important theory in the whole of science, quantum mechanics, a theory that I've spent my life studying.
And that's because back in 1900, the light bulb presented a rather strange problem. Engineers knew that if you heated the filament with electricity, it glowed. The physics that underpinned this, though, was completely unknown. But something as basic as the relationship between the temperature of the filament and the color of light it produces was still a complete mystery. A mystery they were obviously keen to solve. And with the help of the new German state, they saw how to steal a march on their competitors. In 1887, the German government invested millions in a new technical research institute here in Berlin, the Physikalisch-Technische Reichsanstalt, or PTR. Then, in 1900, they enlisted a bright, if somewhat straight-laced scientist to help work here. His name was Max Planck. Planck took on a deceptively simple problem: why the color of the light changes as the filament gets hotter. To get a sense of the puzzle facing Planck, I'm going to ride this bicycle with an old-fashioned lamp powered by an old-fashioned dynamo. Obviously, the faster I go, the brighter the light. The more I pedal, the more electricity the dynamo produces, the hotter the filament in the lamp, and the brighter the light. But the light the bulb makes isn't just getting brighter. It's changing color, too. As I speed up, the color shifts from red to orange to yellow. Right, now I'm going to really belt it. Now the bulb's filament is getting even hotter, but although it certainly gets brighter, the color seems to stay the same, yellow-white. Why doesn't the light get any bluer? To investigate, Planck and his colleagues built this, a black body radiator. It's a special tube they could heat to a very precise temperature and a way to measure the color or frequency of the light it produced. Nowadays, over 100 years later, the PTR still do exactly this kind of measurement, just much more accurately. The temperature inside here is 841 degrees centigrade. I can feel the heat coming off, and it's glowing with a lovely orangey red color. It's about the same color as my bike light when I'm cycling slowly. But I want to see something hotter still. The temperature inside here is about 2,000 degrees centigrade. And it's glowing with a much brighter, whiter colored light. To produce light of this intensity and color requires a power of about 40 kilowatts. Now, that's equivalent to about 400 Ms on a bike cycling very fast, or the combined output of the entire Tour de France. Although the light is whiter, it's red-white. There's very little blue. Why is blue so much harder to make than red? And further up the spectrum, beyond blue, the so-called ultraviolet is hardly produced at all, even when we look at things as hot as the sun. Even the sun, at a temperature of 5,500 degrees centigrade, produces mostly white, visible light, and makes remarkably little ultraviolet light, given how hot it is. Why is this? Why is ultraviolet light so hard to make? This remarkable failure of common sense so perplexed scientists of the late 19th century that they gave it a very dramatic name. They called it the ultraviolet catastrophe.
Planck took a crucial first step to solving this. He found the precise mathematical link between the color of light, its frequency, and its energy. But he didn't understand the connection. However, it was another weird anomaly that would really put the cat amongst the pigeons. In the late 19th century, scientists were studying the then newly discovered radio waves and how they were transmitted. And to do that, they were building experimental rigs very similar to this one. Basically, by spinning this disc, they could generate huge voltages that caused sparks to jump across the gap between the two metal spheres. But in doing so, they discovered something very unexpected to do with light. They found that by shining a powerful light source on the spheres, they could make the sparks jump across more easily. This suggested a mysterious and unexplained connection between light and electricity. To understand what was happening, scientists used this. It's called a gold leaf electroscope. It's basically a more sensitive version of the spark gap apparatus. Now, first of all, I have to charge it up. What I'm doing is adding an excess of electrons that are pushing the two gold leaves apart. Now, first I take red light and shine it on the metal surface. And nothing happens. Even if I increase the brightness of the light, still the gold leaves aren't affected. Now I'll try this special blue light, rich in ultraviolet. Immediately, the gold leaves collapse. Light can clearly remove static electric charge from the leaves. It can somehow knock out the electrons I added to them. But why is ultraviolet light so much better at doing this than red light? This new puzzle became known as the photoelectric effect. The ultraviolet catastrophe and the photoelectric effect were big problems for physicists, because neither could be understood using the best science of the time. The science that said, quite unequivocally, that light was a wave. All around us, we see light behaving in a perfectly common sense, wavy way. Look at the shadow of my hand. It's fuzzy around the edges. We understand this as the light hitting the sides of my hand and bending and smearing out slightly, just like water waves around an obstruction. Perfectly common sense, wave-like behavior. And here's something else, something rather beautiful. Look at these soap bubbles. Shine a light on them and gorgeous colored patterns emerge from nowhere. And this was easily explained if you accept that light was a wave, reflecting off the outer and inner layers of a thin soap film and breaking up into the colors of the rainbow. Rather like ripples on the surface of water, light was simply ripples of energy spreading through space. And this was as firmly accepted as the fact that the Earth was round. But although this wave theory worked perfectly well for shadows and bubbles, when it came to the ultraviolet catastrophe and the photoelectric effect, the wheels started coming off. The problem was this: how could light do this? To truly grasp how absurd this phenomenon was, it might be useful to consider how waves in water behave. This is the wave tank at the RNLI's headquarters in Dorset. It's used to train lifeboat teams to deal with a range of different kinds of water waves. First, small waves, just 30 centimeters high. These waves don't have much energy, hardly enough energy to knock this top pan off the other. But when the waves grow to over 1.5 meters, it's a very different proposition.
And they're really throwing me about. There's no way I could keep this can balanced on the top.
It's clear what water waves are telling us. Bigger, more intense waves have more power. They easily knock me and the cans around. So if light was a wave, more intensity should knock out more electrons. But that's not what happened. Remember, no matter how intense the red light was, it still didn't budge electrons from the metal. But weirdly, weak ultraviolet worked within seconds. So thinking of light as a wave just wasn't adding up.
To resolve this, someone needed to think the unthinkable. And in 1905, someone did. You may well have heard of him. His name was Albert Einstein.
This is the Sternwach Observatory in Berlin. Perched on top is a strange, huge iron and steel construction. But it's not a gun. It's actually a telescope. Built in 1896, the telescope was one of the largest of its kind in the world and made the observatory the go-to place to engage and astound the public in new science.
Albert Einstein gave a very famous public lecture here on his theory of relativity, which is, of course, what he's most famous for. But it's not the work that won him the Nobel Prize.
In 1905, he'd also come up with a new theory to explain the photoelectric effect. And what he suggested was revolutionary and even heretical.
He argued that we have to forget all about the idea that light is a wave and think of it instead as a stream of tiny bullet-like particles. The term he used to describe a particle of light was a quantum.
To Einstein, a quantum was a tiny lump of energy. And although in 1905 the word wasn't new, the idea that light could be a quantum seemed crazy. And yet, following Einstein's heretical line of thought to its logical conclusion, solved all the problems with light at a single stroke.
I'll try to explain how this helps using a rough analogy. Of course, like all analogies, it's far from perfect, but hopefully it'll give you a sense of the physics to help you understand why thinking of light as a stream of particles solves the mystery of the photoelectric effect. In this analogy, these red balls represent Einstein's light quanta.
And those cans over there are the electricity held in the metal.
Now, in the original experiment, they made electricity flow from the surface of the metal by shining light on it. In my analogy, I'm going to try and knock those tin cans over using these red balls.
Absolutely no effect. That's just like red light. According to Einstein, each particle of red light carries very little energy because red light has a low frequency. So even a very bright red light with many red light particles can't dislodge any electrons from the metal plate, just like the red balls.
Now I'm going to use heavier balls, like these blue golf balls, and I'm going to try and knock off the tin cans with these.
They're like the ultraviolet light in the experiment. Each individual light particle carries more energy because ultraviolet light is higher frequency. Just a few of them, like a dim ultraviolet light, are enough to knock the electrons out of the metal plate and collapse the gold leaf. So Einstein's idea that light is made up of tiny particles or quanta is a wonderful explanation of the photoelectric effect. I remember when I first learnt about this, being blown away by its sheer elegance and simplicity. But what's more, Einstein's nifty idea also helped solve Planck's mystery of the light bulb. There was more red than ultraviolet because ultraviolet quanta took so much more energy to make, about 100 times more energy. No wonder there are so few of them.
That moment at the beginning of the 20th century signaled a genuine revolution because it demonstrated that the kind of physical science that people were doing right back to Newton and Laplace and people like that, that you needed a completely new approach.
Around here, we like to do things the manual way.
Physics has never recovered from that moment, in the sense that it's built on that moment. That's where modern physics really began.
But Einstein's theory also left physicists with a dizzying paradox, defying all common sense. Light was definitely a wave, which explained shadows and bubbles. And now it was definitely a particle too, Einstein's quanta, explaining the photoelectric effect and the ultraviolet catastrophe. Then, just a few years after Einstein's brilliant, crazy idea, the paradox got a lot deeper and a whole lot weirder. Because what seemed to be a curious mystery about light was about to become a battleground about the nature of reality itself. (1922). The Western world is in the grip of a revolution, a cultural revolution. James Joyce's Ulysses is published. Stravinsky is at the height of his powers, and Chaplin has just released his first serious movie. The Ottoman Empire collapses. Europe is still recovering from the war to end all wars, in which millions of men lost their lives. Russia is newly communist. Meanwhile, America is exporting jazz to the world. Thank you. In art, politics, literature, economics, there was an insatiable appetite for change. This was the birth of modernism.
You got a heart that there's no way of knowing. Can see where you are, but can't see where you're going. And I'm stuck here still. I'm tangled up with you. This whole world can be so uncertain.
But, and I might get into trouble for saying this, I would argue that the upheaval that took place in physics at this time would eclipse them all and have far longer-lasting consequences. It had begun with the discovery of the weird and contradictory wave-particle nature of light. It ended up as an epic battle fought between the greatest minds in science for the highest possible stakes, the nature of reality itself.
I know I deserve you, I know you're my savior, but when I observe you, you change your behavior so
On one side, a new wave of modernist revolutionary scientists and their leader, the brilliant Danish physicist, Niels Bohr. On the other side, the voice of reason, Albert Einstein, at the height of his powers and now world famous, a formidable adversary. The battle raged for decades. Actually, in some ways, it still does. It was fought across the world in universities, at conferences, in bars and cafes. It would reduce grown men to tears. And it began with a deceptively simple experiment.
this whole world can be so uncertain.
But weirdly, it was an experiment that wasn't even about light. It was about the particles that make electricity. In the mid-1920s, an experiment was carried out at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey in America, which uncovered something entirely unexpected about electrons. Now, at the time, it was accepted without question that electrons were these tiny lumps of matter, small but solid particles like miniature billiard balls. In the experiment, they fired a beam of electrons at a crystal and watched how they scattered. Now, that's entirely equivalent to taking a beam of electrons, say, from an electron gun, and firing it at a screen with two slits in it, so that the electrons pass through the slits and hit another screen at the back. What the Bell scientists found shocked the physics world to the core. To understand why, consider a similar experiment with water waves. I've set up a simple experiment. I have a water ripple tank placed on top of an overhead projector. I have a generator producing waves that pass through two narrow gaps. The projector beams the image of the waves onto the back wall. You can see as the waves come in from the left and squeeze through the two gaps, they spread out on the other side and interfere with each other. What this means is that when you get the crest from one wave meeting the crest from another, they add up to make a higher wave. But when the crest from one meets a trough, they cancel out. This gives rise to these characteristic lines leading to the signature wave pattern. Bands of light and dark. Whenever you see these light and dark bands, the signature wave pattern, you know without doubt that you've got wave-like behavior. So, guess what they saw in New Jersey? Now it seemed that firing electrons, tiny solid particles, through the two gaps produced exactly the same kind of pattern, bands of light and dark. First, light, for a long time believed to be a wave, was found to sometimes behave like particles. And now electrons, for a long time believed to be particles, were behaving like waves. But it was actually stranger than that. The wave pattern wasn't merely some result of the entire beam of electrons. More recently, this experiment has been repeated in labs around the world by firing one electron at a time through the slits onto the screen. At first, each electron seems to land randomly on the screen. But gradually, a pattern forms. The signature wave pattern. Let me be quite clear about just how weird this is. Remember from the wave tank experiment where the signature wave pattern only exists because each wave passes through both slits and then its two pieces interfere with each other. But here, every individual electron, each single particle, is passing alone through the slits before it hits the screen. And yet, each single electron is still contributing to the signature wave pattern. Each electron has to be behaving like a wave. To explain this strange result, Niels Bohr and his colleagues created quantum mechanics, a crazy theory of light and matter that embraced contradiction and didn't care that it was almost impossible to understand. As Niels Bohr himself said, anyone who isn't shocked by quantum theory hasn't understood it. So, viewers, I'm going to take our tiny electron and use it to delve deep into the heart of reality. And yes, prepare to be shocked, because this is the only way to explain what we observe when a single electron travels through the slits and hits the screen. Quantum mechanics says this: we can't describe what's traveling as a physical object. All we can talk about are the chances of where the electron might be. This wave of chance somehow travels through both slits, producing interference just like the water wave. Then, when it hits the screen, what was just the ghostly possibility of an electron mysteriously becomes real. Let me try and capture just how weird this is with an analogy. If I spin this coin, then all the time it's spinning, it's a blur. I can't tell if it's heads or tails. But if I stop it, I force it to decide, and it's heads. So before, it was sort of not heads or tails, but a mixture of both. But as soon as I've stopped it, I've forced it to make up its mind. This is what Bohr and his supporters claimed was happening with our electrons. In a sense, as it spins, the coin is both heads and tails. Similarly, the electron's wave of chance passes through both slits, two paths at the same time. Our coin then stops at heads. The ethereal wave of probability hits the screen and only then becomes a particle. The quantum world was unlike anything ever seen before. It's hard to overstate just how crazy this is. Bohr was effectively claiming that one can never know where the electron actually is at all until you measure it. And it's not just that you don't know where the electron is. It's weirdly as though the electron itself is everywhere at once. Bear in mind that electrons are among the commonest and most basic building blocks of reality. And yet, here's Bohr saying that only by looking do we actually conjure their position into existence. It's like there's a curtain between us and the quantum world, and behind it, there is no solid reality, just the potential for reality. Things only become real when we pull back the curtain and look. And this view, ladies and gentlemen, became known as the Copenhagen interpretation. Persuasive as it might seem, many people couldn't stomach Niels Bohr's outlandish ideas. And they found a natural leader in the most powerful man in science. Albert Einstein hated this interpretation with every fiber of his being. He famously said, "Does the moon cease to exist when I don't look at it?"
He was very unhappy because it gave limits to knowledge that he didn't think should be final. He thought there should be a better underlying theory.
Over the next 10 years, Einstein and Bohr would argue passionately about whether quantum mechanics meant giving up on reality or not. Then, with two other scientists, Nathan Rosen and Boris Podolsky, Einstein thought they'd found a way to win the argument. He was convinced he'd found a fatal flaw in the Copenhagen interpretation, and its claim that reality was summoned into existence by the act of looking at it. At the heart of Einstein's argument was an aspect of quantum mechanics called entanglement. Now, entanglement is this special, incredibly close relationship between a pair of quantum particles whose fates are intertwined. For example, if they were created in the same event. Let me try and explain this by imagining the two particles are spinning coins. Imagine these coins are two electrons, created from the same event and then moved apart from each other. Quantum mechanics says that because they're created together, they're entangled. And now many of their properties are forever linked, wherever they are. Remember, the Copenhagen interpretation says that until you measure one of the coins, neither of them is heads or tails. In fact, heads and tails don't even exist. And here's where entanglement makes this weird situation even weirder. When we stop the first coin and it becomes heads, because the coins are linked through entanglement, the second coin will simultaneously become tails. And here's the crucial thing. I can't predict what the outcome of my measurement will be, only that they will always be opposite. Einstein seized on this because it meant that something was happening between the two coins that was almost too crazy to imagine. It's as if the two coins are secretly communicating instantaneously across space and time, even if the first coin was on Earth and the other was on Pluto. Einstein refused to believe this instantaneous, faster-than-light communication. His theory of relativity said that nothing could travel that fast, not even information. So how could one coin instantaneously know how the other would land? He disparagingly called it spooky action at a distance and claimed it was a fatal flaw in the Copenhagen interpretation. What's more, he had a better idea. Einstein believed there was a simpler interpretation, that somehow the destiny of the two coins, whether or not they ended up heads or tails, was already fixed long before we observed them. He said that although it seemed the coin was deciding to be, say, heads at the moment of observation, actually that decision was taken long before. It was just hidden from us. In Einstein's mind, quantum particles were nothing like spinning coins. They were more like, say, a pair of gloves, left and right, separated into boxes. We don't know which box contains which glove until we open one. But when we do, and find, say, a right-handed glove, then immediately we know that the other box contains the left-handed glove. But crucially, this requires no spooky action at a distance. Neither glove has been altered by the act of observation. Both of them were either left or right-handed glove from the beginning, and the only thing that has changed is our knowledge. So, which is the true description of reality? Bohr's coins, which only become real when we look at them, and then magically communicate to each other? Or Einstein's gloves, which are hidden from us, but are definitely left or right from the beginning? In other words, is there an objective reality, as Einstein believed, or not, as Bohr maintained? In the late 1930s, as the world plunged into war, there was no way to answer this question. The battle to understand the nature of reality was deadlocked. The war rolled across Europe, and many of the leading scientists fled to the United States. Then, as the Second World War led inexorably to the Cold War, American science, backed by dollar bills and a new vision of the future, boomed.
Remember, after the war, physicists came back raring to go and try to apply the ideas of quantum theory to atoms, the interaction between electrons and light and what have you. You didn't need to worry about the philosophical side of things to make progress with that. So, as you say, it really took a back seat.
Quantum mechanics led to a profound understanding of semiconductors, which helped create the modern electronic age. It produced lasers, revolutionizing communications, breathtaking new medical advances, and breakthroughs in nuclear power. Quantum mechanics was so successful that most working physicists deliberately chose to ignore Einstein's objections. It simply didn't matter to them because it worked. They even coined a phrase for it: shut up and calculate. And the price for this success was that Bohr and Einstein's debate on the reality of the quantum world was simply brushed under the carpet. And amidst all this success and pragmatism, there were few who still worried what it all meant. But as the 50s rolled headlong into the 60s, one lone dissenter worked out how to settle the argument once and for all.
Have a nice day.
John Bell, I think it's fair to say, isn't well known to the general public.
Get your gear here.
But to physicists like me, he's, well, a hero. He was an original thinker with real courage in his convictions, and the story of his rise to become one of the greats of physics is made even more remarkable when you consider how he started. He was born in Belfast in the 1920s into a poor working-class family. His father was a horse dealer, and they really struggled to get him into Queen's University Belfast to study physics. In fact, he was the only one in his family to even finish school. This, I believe, made him insatiably curious, fiery, and stubborn. I remember meeting John Bell in 1989, a year before he died. We were both at a conference in America, and we happened to be sharing a lift just after both attending a talk on quantum mechanics. Keen to say something to the great John Bell, I said I thought the speaker's conclusions were completely crazy. He stared at me with his piercing blue eyes, and for a moment I thought my fledgling physics career was going down the drain. But as the lift doors opened and he was about to leave, he said, "Yes, I completely agree with you. Haven't they heard of the helium problem?" To this day, I'm not quite sure what the helium problem is, but I was just so relieved that John Bell and I agreed. For many years, he worked here at Britain's Atomic Energy Research Centre at Harwell, who built this early experimental nuclear reactor called Dido.
Buy something next time, okay?
It was here that he started pondering the deep and worrying questions that quantum mechanics raised. Did the quantum world only exist when it was observed? Or was there a deeper truth out there waiting to be discovered? In fact, he was so troubled, he began to wonder if there was a problem at the heart of quantum mechanics. He famously said, "I hesitate to think it might be wrong, but I know it is rotten." And so in the early 1960s, Bell decided to try and resolve the crisis at the heart of quantum physics. It was an epic challenge. After all, how do you check if something is real, if something is or isn't there, all without looking? How do you look behind the curtain without pulling it open? But John Bell came up with a brilliant way of doing exactly that. I think this is one of the most ingenious ideas in the whole of physics. It's certainly one of the most difficult to understand and explain. But I'm going to try and have a go, and yes, I'm afraid I'm going to use another analogy. This time, I'm going to play a game of cards, but it's one for the highest possible stakes, the nature of reality itself. The card game is against a mysterious quantum dealer. The cards he deals represent any subatomic particles, or even quanta of light, photons. And the game we'll play will ultimately tell us whether Einstein or Bohr was right. Now, the rules of the game are deceptively simple. The dealer is going to deal 2 cards face down. If they're the same color, I win. If they're different colors, I lose. So, I have a red, so I need another red to win. It's black, I lose. Again, opposite colors, I've lost both those. That's 4 in a row. That's 6 pairs in a row that I've lost. Okay, I think I know what the dealer's doing here. Clearly, the deck has been rigged in advance so that every pair come out as opposite colors. But there's a simple way to catch the dealer out. So what we can do now is change the rules of the game. This time, if they are the opposite color, I win.
You must be here about
But
the
once
vines.
again, every
You're very
time,
welcome.
my evil quantum opponent beats me.
Catch you later then.
But again, I can see what the crafty dealer could have done. Maybe while I wasn't looking, he's switched the pack and rigged it so that it always lands in his favor. Now every pair is the same color. Rigged decks, remember, were what Einstein thought was really happening in the entanglement experiment. He said that just like the gloves were already placed in the box, so the evil dealer stacked the cards before we played. But Niels Bohr's idea was very different. He said red and black don't even exist until you turn them over. Bell's genius was that he came up with a way of deciding once and for all who was right, Einstein or Bohr. This is how he did it. I'm now not going to tell the dealer which game I want to play, same color wins or different color wins, until after he's dealt the cards. Now, because he can never predict which rules I'm going to play by, he can never stack the deck correctly. Now, he can't win. Or can he? So now the rules are different wins. The same, okay? Same color wins. This gets to the very heart of Bell's idea. If we now start playing and I win as many as I lose, then Einstein was right. The dealer is just a trickster with a gift for sleight of hand. Reality may be tricky, but it does have an objective existence. But what if I lose? Well, then I'm forced to admit that there is no sensible explanation. Each card must be sending secret signals to the other across space and time in defiance of everything we know. I'm forced to accept that at the fundamental quantum level, reality is truly unknowable. Bell reduced this idea into a single mathematical equation that tells us once and for all what seemed unanswerable: how reality really is. John Bell published his idea in 1964, and the extraordinary thing is, at the time, the entire physics community ignored him. Total radio silence. It seems the world simply wasn't ready. Perhaps it was because his equation seemed untestable, or just because nobody thought it was worth investigating. But that was about to change. And the change would come from a very unexpected place. America was in crisis over Vietnam, Watergate, feminism, the Black Panthers. And while all this was going on, a small group of hippie physicists were working at the University of Berkeley in California. They did all the hippie things. They smoked dope, they popped LSD, they debated things like Buddhism and telepathy. And they loved quantum mechanics. In its weird version of reality, they saw parallels with their own esoteric beliefs. Their hippie New Age style physics also caught the attention of the public, who read their crazy hippie books that mixed quantum mechanics with Eastern mysticism. Books like The Tao of Physics, The Dancing Wooly Masters, and my personal favorite, Space, Time and Beyond, Towards an Explanation of the Unexplainable. But more importantly for our story, the story of quantum mechanics, these hippie physicists also turned their attention to Einstein's now famous thought experiment and what it told us about the nature of reality. They saw Niels Bohr's secret signaling as proof that physics supported their own ideas. Because if two particles could spookily communicate across space, then ESP, telepathy, and clairvoyance were probably true as well. If only they could prove it really existed. Then, in 1972, they realized that with a bit of mathematical sleight of hand, they could take Bell's equation and experimentally test it. One of their group, John Clauser, borrowed some equipment from the lab he was working in and set up the first genuine and ultimate test of quantum mechanics. This is a picture of that first experiment, built of leftovers and stolen equipment. Over the next few years, it was improved by a team led by Alain Aspect in Paris, making its results more reliable. Over 10 years after Bell first proposed his equation, finally it could be put to the test. This is a modern version of the experiment first carried out by John Clauser and then Alain Aspect. Here, a crystal converts laser light into pairs of entangled light quanta, photons, making two very precise beams. These photons are passed round and bent back again until they pass through these detectors. The two photons are like the two cards the evil dealer places in front of me. We'll measure a property of the photons called polarization, which is equivalent to the color of the playing cards in my game. So, for instance, winning with two matching red cards might be the same as two photons with matching polarization. But because this is quantum mechanics, it's more complicated than my simple card game. And these dials here allow me to measure a second property of the photons as well. Now, that's equivalent to me not only trying to guess the color of the face of the cards, but also trying to guess the color of the back of the cards. Okay, so we're now going to switch on the laser and start the experiment. So this number here gives me the number of photon pairs coming through the experiment. That's equivalent to the pairs of cards in my game. The graph here dropping down gives me the probability that I can win, that I'm guessing right. The more photons, the more accurate it becomes. I'll stop at an uncertainty of about 1%. And the final answer is 0.56. So if I put that into my equation, I now need to run the experiment 3 more times, corresponding to the 4 different settings of these dials. Each run is now like a different set of rules for the quantum dealer.
Good luck.
And when I add them up and get the answer, if it's less than 2, then Einstein was right. If it's greater than 2, then Bohr was right. Okay, so now for the second setting. Just remember what the experiment will show. If the numbers come out less than 2, then it's proof the dealer has been stacking the deck. This was Einstein's view. Okay, so the number I get this time is 0.82. Now reset for run 3. But if the result is greater than 2, then the deck cannot be stacked, and something else is at work. Okay, so the run 3 result is minus 0.59. And finally, run 4. This last number will finally reveal if the world follows common sense or something much more bizarre. Okay, so our final result is in, and it's 0.56. So if we turn the laser off, right, I better just work out the answer. And there we have it, 2.53. It's a number greater than 2, absolute proof that Albert Einstein was wrong and Niels Bohr was right. The significance of this result is simply enormous. Just remember what it means. Einstein's version of reality cannot be true. No amount of clever jiggery-pokery with our experiment can cheat nature. The two entangled photons' properties couldn't have been set from the beginning, but are summoned into existence only when we measure them. something strange is linking them across space, something we can't explain or even imagine other than by using mathematics. And weirder, photons do only become real when we observe them. In some strange sense, it really does suggest the moon doesn't exist when we're not looking. It truly defies common sense. No wonder towards the end of his life, Einstein wrote, "All these 50 years of conscious brooding have brought me no nearer to the question, what are light quanta? Every Tom, Dick, and Harry thinks he knows it, but he is mistaken." The experiment only confirms this. Whatever is happening, we just don't understand it. But it doesn't mean we should stop looking. While it's true that Einstein's dream of finding a reasonable, common-sense explanation was shattered for good, my own personal view is that this doesn't necessarily banish physical reality. Like Einstein, I still believe there might be a more palatable explanation underlying the weird results of quantum mechanics. But one thing is clear. Whether there are physical, spooky connections, whether there are parallel universes, whether we bring reality into existence by looking, whatever the truth is, the weirdness of the quantum world won't go away. It'll rear its ugly head somewhere. 120 years ago, the greatest scientific revolution ever was brought about by a light bulb. And scientists are still using powerful light sources, like X-rays, to unlock nature's mysteries. This is the Diamond Light Source. It's Britain's single largest science facility. The X-rays produced here are 10 billion times more powerful than the hospital X-ray. With that sort of power, scientists can slice into matter and glimpse those quantum secrets inside. Researchers here are using this powerful light beam to investigate new materials, which may have the potential to bring about an electronics breakthrough as great as any before. Just as the quantum pioneers of the 20s and 30s ended up bringing about a scientific and technological revolution, so this generation of physicists are set to usher in a new quantum era. An era where Einstein's hated quantum entanglement now produces unbreakable computer security, new kinds of communication systems, super-fast computers, and other advances we can't yet even imagine. And this is why quantum mechanics thrills and frustrates me. It's capricious, it's counterintuitive, it even sometimes feels just plain wrong. And yet, it still surprises us every day. And I, for one, believe that our knowledge of the quantum world is still far from complete, that there are greater truths about nature yet to be discovered. And that's still what keeps me awake at night. Next week, join me as my journey into the quantum world gets even more surprising. I investigate how its weird rules are crucial for life, and how the bizarre behavior of subatomic particles might even influence evolution itself. Welcome to a new and very strange world of nature. It's been taken over by the weird subatomic particles of quantum physics. As a physicist, I've spent my working life studying how these particles behave in the laboratory. But now I'm heading out into the natural world. I'm on a mission to prove that quantum physics can solve the greatest mysteries in biology. This is a real adventure for me. I'm very much out of my comfort zone, trying to apply the very careful ideas I'm familiar with in a physics laboratory to the messy world of living things. I believe that quantum physics could hold many of life's secrets. That deep in the cells of animals, particles glide through walls like ghosts. That when plants capture sunlight, their cells are invaded by shimmering waves that can be everywhere at the same time. And that even our human senses are tuning in to strange quantum vibrations. In the fantastic world of quantum biology, life is a game of chance, played by quantum rules. This is what I hope to convince you of, to show you that quantum mechanics is essential in explaining many of the important processes in life, and potentially that quantum mechanics may even underpin the very existence of life itself.
Lovely afternoon for a fish, or perhaps a purchase?
My quest begins with one of the most majestic sights in nature: migration.
Here's what I've got.
Every winter, barnacled geese arrive right on cue at the same Scottish river. The end of an epic 2,000-mile voyage from Svalbard, high above the Arctic Circle. Of course, many birds head south for winter, then back home for summer. But for decades, exactly how birds navigated with such accuracy was one of the greatest mysteries in biology. So the most recent discovery has caused a sensation. In the past few years, one species of bird has helped create a scientific revolution. I was one of many physicists who were shocked to discover that it navigates using one of the strangest tricks in the whole of science. It utilizes a quirk of quantum mechanics, one that bamboozled even the greatest of physicists, from Richard Feynman to Albert Einstein himself. So you might be surprised to discover the identity of this mysterious creature. Say hello to the quantum robin. This is the European robin. Every year, she migrates from northern Europe to the tip of Spain and back. In this laboratory in the woods, biologist Henrik Moritzen is trying to solve the mystery of how she does it. But he's found himself in my world, the strange world of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics describes the very weird behavior of subatomic particles. Down in this realm of the very small, we have to abandon common sense and intuition. Instead, this is a world where objects can spread out like waves. Quantum particles can be in many places at once and send each other mysterious communications.
I set out to understand how the bird finds its way, but it just turned out that the data more and more pointed towards this as the only explanation that could bring all the different results together.
Henrik's investigating a long-standing theory that robins navigate by the Earth's magnetic field. His laboratory is an ingenious magnetic birdcage. And these plastic cones, lined with scratch-sensitive paper, provide the key measurements. Henrik's artificial magnetic field is like the Earth's, except that he can point it in any direction he likes. Inside their cones, the robins always respond to the field, leaving scratches in a single direction. The big mystery is how. The Earth's magnetic field is incredibly weak, far too weak for any living creature to detect. But Henrik has found an intriguing clue by giving the quantum robin a mask.
We have a little leather hood, similar to what you put on a falcon, you know, but just for a robin. And you have then a hole in front of one eye or a hole in front of the other eye. But what we can see is that if you cover up the right eye, you turn off the magnetic compass processing in the left part of the brain. If you cover up this eye, you turn the compass off in this part of the brain.
The robin's magnetic compass seems to be in her eyes.
I can show you what's going on using my own eye. Now, we use our eyes for vision, but we also have a second light detecting mechanism. If I shine this torch into my eye, you can see that my pupil closes down. It's basically a defense mechanism to protect my eyes.
My eye is responding to particles of light, or photons.
The energy provided by the photons is clearly enough to activate chemical reactions. After all, that's what controls my eye muscles.
Light must be causing similar chemical reactions in the robin's eyes.
I'll be over here.
In fact, it's the power supply for a unique form of magnetic compass inside her cells, in the weird world of subatomic particles. A place where only quantum physics can explain